or on the computer. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. If you are watching, this is part of a series of conversations that I'm holding with my friends. My name is Kristen Chung, and I am a Buddhist chaplain-in-training. We practice in an interfaith fashion. We serve those of all faiths and none. And today we have my guest who has been someone that I've been secretly admiring this whole time, and I'm not sure if she knows. So this is Liz Jenkins, and I would love for her to introduce herself.
Well, the secret admiring is mutual. So yeah, hi, I'm Liz. I'm a writer, kind of in the progressive Christian faith tradition. So that's been a bit of a journey spiritually over the years that I'm sure we'll get more into. But that's kind of where I'm at now. And I have an upcoming book in the next few months, tentatively called Nice Churchy Patriarchy. That's all about women in church and kind of my experiences of and reflections on being a woman in evangelical spaces in my 20s. So yeah, thanks for the invitation to this conversation.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to read your book. I remember reading the earlier drafts and going, wow, she's mentioning Taylor Swift in a book about church patriarchy? Like, this is gonna be amazing. So, and it's so interesting, right? That the 20s is when we met.
Mhm,
So I had met you through my wife. You guys went to
mhm,
college together.
mhm.
And I remember you were always the person who gets everyone together. Like, after college, everyone kind of like does their own thing. But then I remember like you were always really good about making sure that we're still like socially connecting. And now in retrospect, I'm like, Liz is good at building community this whole time outside of the church context, right? And I remember that you had brought us to a service some time ago. And I remember thinking that that's when I learned more about your faith. I think by then were you already in seminary school? I'm trying to remember.
So did you go to service at like in Palo Alto?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so I started seminary my last year in Palo Alto. So it could have overlapped. I don't remember exactly when.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Ah, okay. Because I also have this memory. So I think I have these memories, but I'm not sure of the chronological order.
Yeah, yeah,
You
same.
were the first person I know that is like, someone who's my friend who's working in spirituality as a
Mhm.
job. And I remember thinking that is so cool. Like I want to be like you one day, but I didn't dare to say it.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a mixed bag, like working for a church for sure. But I'm glad that you found your own way into kind of working in spiritual settings too, for sure.
Yeah. So I want to ask you more about like how like almost like a little bit about your book, right? About like your experiences in the progressive faith area. Because I feel like I, along with many others, made a lot of assumptions about Christianity. Like we imagine certain
Mhm,
political ideologies, um,
mhm,
like certain kinds of evangelism, etc.
mhm,
And then especially in America.
mhm.
And like because I grew up in a very evangelical Asian Christian environment, I
Right.
have my own stereotypes about what Christianity is and the way I
Mhm,
practice my faith as well, in the past and now.
mhm.
So for you, like, what would you say is the number one misunderstanding about Christianity as you practice it?
Oh, that's a great question. It feels like a big one, or maybe a little bit hard to pin down because I think that different Christians practice in very different ways. So I think there's a lot of diversity, a lot of tension kind of within the Christian tradition. I think there's very conservative streams of it and very progressive streams of it. And so it's kind of hard to answer in terms of like the Christian faith as a whole. But I mean, maybe that's a misconception that it's kind of all one way. And I think there are some very like loud voices who kind of want people to think that it's all one way, but it's really not. And I think I've I think I've experienced that. I mean, I grew up going to kind of a more like mainline progressive-ish Protestant Presbyterian church. And then I kind of stumbled into a more conservative evangelical stream of Christianity in my 20s, and then have been kind of slowly crawling my way out of there since then.
Mm,
So I think I've kind of experienced some of the different aspects of it.
yeah. So it's like I feel like I didn't know about the more
Mhm,
progressive streams at all until I saw your writing,
mhm,
and the way that you're sharing your perspective. I think it's just not really accessible unless you are already involved in a church community.
mhm, mhm,
Um,
mhm.
so I was
Yeah.
wondering, like, for you, like, what are since you know you are by definition progressive, what are your views on like Buddhism? What is your conception?
Oh yeah, that's also a good question. Um, where to start? I feel like I guess one angle on that is in general, I think that my perspective of an attitude toward religions that are not Christian has changed a lot over the years. And I think there was a time when I was younger when I kind of bought into a more evangelical mindset of kind of these certain Christian beliefs are the only truth, and everybody needs to believe them, otherwise hell, right, is the
Mhm.
threat. Um, and I think that yeah, that's not really a perspective that makes sense to me anymore. And I think I've kind of come around, hopefully, to a place of a lot more respect for other religious practices and for people who practice them. And a lot more appreciation, I think, for kind of the strengths of different religious traditions. So yeah, I think my attitude in general has changed a lot over time. That kind of like need to try to evangelize has been replaced by, I think, more just like admiration or like appreciation. So yeah, I mean, I think Buddhism in particular is not something I know a ton about. So I'd love to hear more from you about what that means to you right now. My understanding is there's a lot of different forms it takes in different cultures, and kind of different forms it takes maybe under different leaders, and a lot of diversity within those traditions too. So um, yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, I feel like I can pretty much say exactly what you said, but just replace the word Christianity with Buddhism. And
Mhm,
that's something that I was
mhm,
really ignorant about as well, even though I was practicing it.
mhm,
In chaplaincy class, actually, we had recently had shared our respective like personal beliefs.
mhm,
And theoretically, you would think that we're all like Buddhist background and we would give like some sort of similar answers. But even within like our own Buddhist chaplaincy class, I was like, wow, there's more difference between what I believe and my classmate believe than what you and I believe, actually.
sure.
So
Yeah.
I think there's like
Mhm,
a lot of overlapping Venn
mhm,
diagram circles between
yeah.
religions that don't come through unless you really dig into
Mhm,
what
mhm,
people's beliefs are. And I think there's also a difference between beliefs and behaviors. Like,
mhm,
so for example, like the stereotypes about like evangelical Christianity, um, and its associations, are there. However, like my friend, Brenna Artinger wrote this thesis on the Buddhist alt-right. There are Nazis
okay.
who have
Okay.
adopted Buddhism as
Wow.
their beliefs, and I'm like, oh, like, and of course, like, there's
Wow.
also like all the terrible things that are happening in like Myanmar and countries like
Mhm,
that, where like Buddhism
mhm,
is used to unfortunately cause a lot of harm to
mhm,
ethnic minorities and
mhm.
refugees. So I think like for me, what I'm really opening my eyes to is that really doesn't matter what religion like it is like there can be good and there can be bad.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, I think I've really come around to that too. I think I mean I was talking with a pastor a couple years back who was doing a lot of kind of inter church work in the Bay Area and connected with a lot of other churches. And was really enjoying that and was kind of like, oh, like I see that like even though we have all these differences, the things that like hold us together are stronger. And I was kind of like, oh, I don't know, like some of those churches. Like I think I've kind of come to feel like I have more in common with people of other faiths who are part of or wanting to be part of the streams of those faiths that are based in love and compassion and nonviolence, working for the good of the community, that kind of thing. Like I feel like we have more in common and more that we can work toward together than say me and an alt-right Christian. Yeah.
For sure. And I really love how you're bringing up like love and community
Mhm,
and service.
mhm,
To because I think like one thing I'm still trying to find the words for is that like in a way, almost especially with Buddhism, there can be it can build towards egocentricity in its own
mm,
in a way that
mhm,
I think
mhm,
like loses the original beauty of the religion, that's what I see
mm,
in all major religions, in terms of like the beauty of like not thinking of yourself first, or even like
mhm,
think of yourself too much, and
mhm.
instead consider the experiences of others.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, and I think that Christianity can go very much in that egocentric direction too, if it's kind of all about me and my personal spiritual growth, and am I like sinning or not sinning? Am I doing or saying the right things, or going to confession or whatever it might be, depending on what kind of Christian tradition. Um, yeah, very just like me centered, like my like goodness, like proving my goodness and improving my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like for your book, and my understanding is like your one of your biggest mission is pointing out per the prevalence of patriarchy.
Mhm.
So I would love to for the audience to know more about that. I know it's a very big topic and you're passionate
Yeah.
about it. So the TLDR, please.
TLDR, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that part of why I wrote it was to kind of expose or increase awareness of, or kind of help people reflect on, and help me reflect on some of the forms patriarchy takes that aren't necessarily like, oh, that's so egregious, but like are a little bit more subtle, or kind of fly under the radar. People don't necessarily consider to be a huge deal. So I think I'm kind of trying to show through storytelling and reflection on those stories that there are these kind of smaller things that really do add up, and kind of all together make a very unequal situation for men and women in church, people of all genders in church, that has some really nasty implications that may not be obvious from like whatever kind of specific incidents themselves. So I think that's kind of, I guess that's kind of the first half of the book, and the second half is more kind of working towards like how do we do better as faith communities? How do we read the Bible and scriptures in ways that aren't as male centered? How do we recover some of the stories of women in Christian history that have gone overlooked or been intentionally ignored? That kind of thing.
So in the first half of your book, you're mentioning that there are nuanced
Mhm.
mm, issues. So what's an
Mhm.
example where you were like, like something is wrong subtly?
Yeah. Oh, so many. I mean, I was just kind of rereading and editing the part this morning where I talk about how so the first couple of years that I worked for my church, just by happenstance, I got this kind of large like corner office that was this very like private space, and it was really nice to have. I really kind of appreciated that, and um, but then in the third year, the church hired another person to work with me in college ministry. He's a young man, and they're kind of like, oh, you guys should share an office. I was like, yeah, totally. They're like, oh, but like we're gonna move you from that like corner office to this like tiny little space that's kind of like this awkward hallway between like the main church office and a children's classroom. And they did that because that corner office was very private, and I think it would have been considered kind of scandalous to have a man and woman working together there. Whereas this like awkward hallway that they moved us to had these huge windows and it was just like this very like public space. So I think that's kind of one of those like, I don't know, subtle, not so subtle things. Where it's like, well, like if I were a man, I think we could have stayed in the better office, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and that affects kind of how you do your work and how you, whether or not you have a sense of like privacy as you have different conversations, and
Mm-hmm.
affects whether it's a comfortable space for you to pray, right? Like I saw that as part of my job to pray for students, and you can't really do that with much like focus or privacy in the office they put me in. So yeah, kind of things like that that are well intentioned in a way, but end up kind of making it harder for someone to do their job.
I see. And were you able to express these issues, or was it kind of swept under the carpet, sort of thing?
I didn't at the time. I'm not sure what would have happened if I had. I don't think there was much wiggle room there, is the impression that I got. I think I didn't want to come across as like someone who was working at the church but wasn't a pastor as entitled, or kind of, I don't know, thinking that like I don't deserve a better office. I don't know. It's kind of this situation where it feels like you have to tread very carefully to not be seen as a woman as kind of demanding too much. So I feel like those were some of the lines that I didn't really know at the time how to walk.
Mm-hmm. I see. And so in the second half of the book, you offer solutions, or at least a pathway.
A path, yeah,
Yeah,
a start.
yeah, for the rest of us to learn from your lessons, right? So, like, what are some examples where you're seeing a lot of progressive movement?
Seeing progressive movement. I mean, there's so much.
Oh, there's like so
um,
much to do.
so much to do. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there is movement, right? Like I think a couple of books that have come out in the last couple of years that have been really influential, at least among people who've been willing to read them, are Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumay, and The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr. And I think that there has been a lot of interest in both of those. And Jesus and John Wayne kind of goes more into recent US history as relates to Christianity, and the kind of like toxic patriarchy that has been kind of deployed by the religious right as a weapon. And then The Making of Biblical Womanhood goes more into kind of scripture passages and kind of church history to argue that patriarchy is not something that Christianity needs to have. It's more something kind of cultural that Christianity took on and made its own.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one way I've seen movement, kind of interest in exploring some of those things. I mean, I see movement at the church I go to now, which is led by a woman, and I feel like a lot of people I meet there, like specifically go there because they didn't want to be in churches that just had white male leadership.
Oh,
So yeah.
that's really great.
Mhm.
And you know, it's really like I didn't even notice as you were naming this. I was like, yeah, who else do I know who's a woman minister? Wait a minute.
Yeah, it's really uncommon, even in the denominations that have allowed that for a long time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And and so do you like what are your thoughts on like more women in leadership positions in Christianity?
I think it's complicated. I mean, I think the world would be better if there were more. I do think there's just a lot of barriers to it. I think I mean, the way that things are now in many churches and denominations, I think it takes a very tough woman with a very specific and strong sense of calling. That's what I'm supposed to be doing, to kind of persevere through all the things that are hard about it.
Hmm.
So yeah, would love to see more, but
That's
I
you.
recognize it's a tough path. What's that?
Oh, I was gonna say that's you.
Uh, kind of, yeah. I mean, I'm not a pastor currently or trying to be. yeah, I feel like my personal like sense of calling, if you will, is more in the writing sphere.
Oh,
Yeah.
gosh. So tell me more about that because I feel like that's what you and I have in common.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I started pursuing the chaplaincy path because
Hmm.
like during the pandemic, I joined an online writing course where I thought I was going to use it to promote my business at the time.
Hmm.
But I ended up writing all about Buddhism. And I was like,
Yeah.
huh, that's weird. Yeah, and then went to my meditation teacher, who encouraged me to join his program because I was like,
Mhm.
I want to pursue this more, but I want to do so wisely with people who can tell me how to do things
Mhm.
correctly, right? Um,
Mhm.
and so it's been really so I feel like that's been my calling,
Mhm. Mhm.
is
Yeah.
to be able to discover my joy of like sharing the message with the world.
Mhm. Mhm.
And and I feel like the of course the challenging part, right, is like I think a lot of people think that I'm like, super Buddhist because like, that's really what I write about, but it's because that's what I
Mhm.
know the most about.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
not necessarily the only thing I believe in, actually.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm.
So for me, like, uh, I would say I'm still pretty theistic, like,
Mhm.
which is where, like, again, like me and my chaplaincy friends, like, differ in some ways.
Okay.
And me and my teachers differ in some ways.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, like, for me, when I'm, like, meditating, it's very funny. The more I learn Buddhism, the closer I feel to Jesus and God. It's like
Yeah.
a
Okay.
very bizarre
Uh-huh.
thing
Uh-huh.
that happens. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
and so I would say that, which is good for chaplaincy, right? Because it
Mhm.
allows me
Mhm.
to practice in an interfaith fashion, like without
Right.
having to refer people as much. Because and
Yeah.
of course, like I'm not as like fluent. Although I have my books now of like prayers, and also I've also like
Okay.
prayer
Okay.
books. But I think like it's like being able to see there is some common thread between a lot of our religions
Yeah.
uh that means that you don't really have to choose if you don't want to, or you can
Mhm.
choose if you want to.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so like I was wondering, right? Like you were talking about writing as a form of your practice. Like
Mhm.
for me, like writing is also is my spiritual practice to
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
extent, though it's almost like a form of meditation that I do
Mhm.
with words.
Mhm.
However, it is very challenging to do it without getting caught up in thoughts and ideas and like
Mhm.
it gets all
Mhm.
like egocentric to some degree.
Mm. Mhm.
So I was wondering like how is writing as a process to you and how do you stay connected to God's presence or however way you practice.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, writing just helps me process things. I think it helps me come to a better understanding of kind of what I believe and where I'm at and what my experiences have been, how I reflect on them now. And then it also helps me kind of recall or kind of integrate things that I'm reading and learning and want to remember. So yeah, I mean, I feel like being more connected with ourselves is kind of part of the spiritual journey, right? And is kind of related to being more connected with God. And I guess I also kind of pursue the like spiritual connection, like God connection part of it through prayer writing. So I've been kind of trying to, this is fairly recent, but I've been trying to kind of set aside some time Monday mornings to kind of write down some prayers. And I share some of them on Instagram, but not all. So it's kind of a combination of personal spiritual practice with kind of wanting to share whatever parts of them I feel like sharing. Yeah, does that kind of answer the question or
Oh gosh,
um
yes and more. I love your prayers on Instagram.
oh
This is
thanks.
the
Thanks.
Instagram content I want. Because to me it's like poetry. Like
Mm,
I'm actually I shouldn't say that. It's like it is poetry. Like so like how like can you tell us more about like how does it work? Like, do you pray first or does it come to you? What's your actual process like?
I mean, it's pretty simple. I just kind of have a particular place I try to sit, and it has a view of the outdoors, which I feel like is nice. And yeah, I think that I mean, I find it helpful to have kind of a moment of just like silence and kind of centering. And I guess it's helpful for me to be in a different place than where I do the rest of my work. And just kind of have that time of like, I'm not trying to check my phone. I'm not trying to like be productive, or efficient. I'm just kind of trying to be still and, like you said, see what comes, see what kind of bubbles up. And I mean, I think they're often related to things I've been thinking about, or things I've heard people say, or things I've read. And yeah, I guess it's kind of back to like my way of processing stuff, but um, trying to do that, addressing God. Um, and at least by the time I post them, I try to do them all in kind of like a plural first person, like a we kind of thing, because I think that it's not just me who's thinking and feeling a lot of these things. So kind of trying to open that up to others and make space that people can find themselves in.
That's wonderful. And like, when you're done with this book, please also publish a prayer book. Because now that I have been through
Mm.
the marketplace to look for prayer books, like there's a lot of like really good ones, but a lot
Mhm,
of them are
mhm,
incredibly either gendered or
mhm,
like
mhm.
contain certain beliefs that I think are a little risky. Like it's
Yeah.
not like they're like bad beliefs, but then I feel like sometimes I'm like, oh, if I don't know a person, I want to come from a place of more neutrality,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
not like so heavy and stuff.
Yeah.
And I feel like your prayers end up being really appropriate
Oh,
for a lot
thanks.
of uses.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Are
Mhm.
there prayer books that you've read that you liked?
Yes. So there's one called Bless the Space Between Us. Have you ever heard of that one?
No.
I need to grab it from the shelf real quick to see the author name, and I'll perhaps link it in description.
Yeah.
But it has like prayers for every occasion.
Mm.
And so it's useful because it's like, okay, if the person feels sick, you read this one.
Mhm, mhm.
However, like this is actually the book I was thinking of, where like most of them are really great, but there's certain phrasings where it's implying that the person should seek forgiveness or
Mm.
something, and I'm like, oh, like that seems a little awkward.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
because it's coming from a very like traditional Christian place,
mhm, mhm.
so I feel like for me, I've been seeking prayers that can be a little bit more, I'm not saying generic, but at least like open to
Like expansive.
interpretation.
Yeah. Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
exactly.
Um,
So definitely like you are one of the biggest resources for prayers that
aw.
I have right now. Um,
Oh, that's awesome.
yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, in chaplaincy, we had a class on prayer, and it was very funny. It was pretty awkward because we are all like Western Buddhists, so we don't really pray very much
Mm,
in the
mhm,
Buddhist
mhm.
context. So our teachers had to like teach us, like, do you know, as Buddhists, we have remembered these things, and we're like, oh,
Oh,
right.
yeah.
So there's a lot of
Huh.
learning in
Mhm,
this
mhm.
arena.
Yeah.
Um,
That's interesting because I think to me, like meditation and prayer have a lot of overlap. Is that not how many Buddhists would see it, or can you say a little more about that?
Oh, that's how I'm realizing it now, but
Mhm,
I'm not
mhm,
sure, especially if you are a much more secular Buddhist. I
mm,
don't think there is as much of a connection
okay.
that's being made.
Mhm, mhm,
Like however, to me, I feel like, meditation is like allowing the silence in the space in order for the divine to
right.
speak to you, right? So it's not coming from yourself. There's enough of
Mhm,
that in the rest of the
mhm,
hours of the
mhm.
day. However, I think like, it can be viewed as both like, the like theistic or not.
Mm, okay. Yeah. And do you feel like you resonate with the theistic part of it more kind of because of your Christian upbringing? Like, is that something that like most of your classmates don't have or don't resonate with?
So one of our teachers is both identifies as both Christian and Buddhist, I think.
Okay.
In fact, I don't know whether she would actually say that directly. She's a
Okay.
reverend. and she says, she has a way of saying it in a very roundabout way that I was trying to copy. I was like, she believes in the divine or something, which
Okay.
can also be Buddha nature, or something like that.
Mm. Mhm.
But I sense that she is also like of a theistic background because of her
Mhm.
upbringing.
Okay.
And it was like for me, I think so. And it took me a long time to realize that like a lot of my zeal is super evangelical Christian in
Mm.
disguise, right?
Just
Like that's what
transferred
I
to Buddhism.
learned. Yeah,
Mm.
it's like from watching like the way that like these like prayers go and the way like these like talks go in Sunday school. There's a certain like vibe that I've picked up
Mhm.
over the years, and I
Yeah.
realize I'm re-expressing them just now in the Buddhist form, right? Like
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah. I feel like I have a lot of like positive associations with Christianity, which I feel really lucky about.
Hmm.
Because at the time, like, I had a lot of friends who were in church, and you get to like read and like sing and
Hmm.
learn about Jesus. But it's very much like what I would call it Jesus on a skateboard vibe. You know, the more like hip cool Jesus
Uh-huh.
sort
Uh-huh.
of situation.
Hmm.
Um, and I've also been to like a Catholic school as well, which was like
Hmm.
a little
Hmm.
bit more dark. Like,
Hmm.
which I'm realizing now is much more about the being a Hong Kong school, like which is very very strict.
Hmm.
And like there was corporal punishment and like very much a message of if you don't behave you will go to hell sort of
Right.
thing. And I remember as a kid, I would tell people to go to hell because that's the worst thing that can happen to you, right?
Right.
And now I'm
Right.
realizing, wow, that's messed up. So, so I think like I've experienced like both the lighter and the darker
Hmm.
sides of Christianity. However,
Hmm.
on the whole, I feel like having some kind of faith that has some wholesome qualities is in general like good for society because those
Hmm.
without this anchor would then be easily like manipulated by
Hmm.
people with like worse intents,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I like that image of an anchor. I think I was kind of thinking about that too. Like, why do I still go to church and consider myself a Christian? Like, yeah, it's a very powerful anchor, like something to kind of connect yourself to that's beyond yourself, and a community that's kind of bigger than you, existed before you, will hopefully exist after you. And kind of a set of like resources, scriptures to draw on, guidance, rituals that kind of mark different rites of passage and times of life. And yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits to kind of organized religion for sure.
Yeah. So like what I'm reading these days is that like church attendance is on the decline,
Oh
right?
yeah,
In
in
church.
the US, yeah.
Yeah. And is Buddhism on the uprise? I feel like
I don't know. Do you know?
I'm actually completely unsure. It seems like there's more and more people showing up.
Yeah, yeah.
But I feel like it's also if they're talking about mindfulness or something, then that's like I guess that's kind of counting, but not really.
There's like
Um,
Buddhist influence things that aren't
yeah,
necessarily the full thing. Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
So and then also I notice this is including myself. Like you and I never talk about this stuff when we're hanging out with friends. And
Right,
I always feel
right,
like, oh, like why not? So I
right.
was wondering for you, what goes through your mind when we're having dinner with our friends?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, in general, I don't know how much other people worry about this, or if it's just me. Like in general, I'm really hesitant to ask people questions that feel personal in a group because I don't know what they're comfortable sharing in front of others. And I mean, I'll ask all sorts of personal questions one on one and figure, if people don't want to share, it's fine. And if they do, that's great. I'd love to hear. But in a group, it's kind of like, oh, it feels more awkward to like turn down a question, or like it just feels kind of like it might create an uncomfortable moment. And I do think that religion and spirituality is a very personal thing. And so yeah, like I want to be able to talk about it openly and hear what other people think about it, but also don't want to be invasive, I guess would be a word. And I mean, obviously our friends, I think have kind of a variety of different experiences with religion or not much experience with religion. And so I think it's yeah, it's not always an easy thing to talk about in kind of a more mixed group. I think it's easier to talk about when people have some sort of common context of like, we go to this church or the
Mhm.
temple or whatever. So yeah, how about you?
That's really wise. I feel like I've been breaking the boundaries a little bit more lately.
Good,
But I'll
yeah.
do it like, I'll be like, can you help me with my chaplaincy homework? Can you
Hmm.
answer this question? Do you pray? To whom do you pray? Like, I can
Yeah.
like, but really it's because I'm actually curious,
Hmm. Hmm.
and now I have an excuse to ask these questions.
Yeah.
hmm and it's
How do
been
you?
really
Mhm.
interesting to learn, like, oh, like, you go to mass, like,
Mhm. Mhm.
mass in this French church, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that, like, and it allows me
Mhm.
to like have an opportunity to learn from other faiths as well,
Yeah.
so that I can have more exposure to the different ways that people practice.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. You feel like people have been pretty open to talking about these things when you've asked.
hmm
Mhm.
Yeah. That was very funny. There was a recent conversation I had with one of our mutual friends, who's now pretty evangelical Christian. Like, and I didn't know that.
Okay. I may not know that
So,
either.
yeah, and it was like, wow, like it's just like she's normally very like quiet, but then
Mhm.
like once this topic came out, I was like, wow, it's a whole different person in here. So I
Interesting.
think
Yeah.
just being able to see the different personas that are
Mhm.
within us, like,
Mhm.
depending on these contexts, has been super
Right.
useful too.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I also wanted to ask you about like LGBTQ
Mhm.
and other letters.
Yeah.
Um, because I have a friend who is who considers herself like a queer, like Christian, like
Mhm.
Buddhist, essentially. She's almost like me, and like
Yeah.
and has like, a much harder time because, like, she lives in a country where it's a lot more conservative.
Mhm.
So and especially it was became we joked that, oh gosh, like you become like a super rare Pokemon or something, because to be this combination of things,
Right.
quite
Right.
challenging. And I remember
Mhm.
I actually was a little bit like scared about finding out your beliefs about queer people.
Mhm.
Actually, I was trying to
Mhm.
like be like, okay, I just don't have to know. Don't ask, don't tell what this actually
Right.
believes, just in case.
Oh.
Oh, so I was, but then I'm learning that you like, I was asking you for books, and you were like, oh yeah, like this book and that book,
Mhm.
and these like newer interpretations of the Bible. And
Mhm.
my understanding is that you do translations yourself
Mhm.
as
From the
well.
New Testament. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So tell me more about like what you're discovering as you're translating it for yourself. Like, well, what are we getting? What
Oh.
are the breadths of interpretation here?
Oh, that's a big question too. Um, I mean, I think I'll start with kind of the more general, like, it sounds like there's a question of kind of like, what do you believe about LGBTQ people and relationships? And I think that, like you weren't totally wrong to be scared to ask that because I used to go along with kind of the right-wing evangelical view, like gay marriage is bad, vote against it, Christians should not be doing it, whatever, like um because I think that, when you um when it seems like everyone who kind of believes the same Christian things that you do is going along with that, then you just kind of go along with it too, unless you make a pretty concerted effort otherwise. So I think it wasn't until kind of my mid 20s that I made a concerted effort to really think things through. Um, so it was, yeah, it was definitely a journey over many years of kind of moving from um, voting against even just like civil gay marriage, kind of moving more to a stage of uncertainty of like, oh, there's actually really different ways to read the Bible and think about Christian tradition and these things. Um, and kind of realizing that like this anti-gay stance is hurting people. Like I don't know if I'd fully internalized or kind of dealt with that until I kind of had to make a specific effort to. Um, So yeah, I think through a combination of kind of reading and learning more and hearing people's stories, I kind of moved from like being pretty sure on one side to being very uncertain, to being kind of pretty sure on the affirming side. And that's been a journey that kind of put me at odds with the church that I was going to at the time. And but you know, we're through it on the other side, and at a church that shares some more similar values in that way. Yeah, so I mean, I think as far as you're asking about the scripture passages, yeah, I mean, I think that there's some very literal ways of reading the Bible that have led people to think, you know, homosexuality is a sin. And that, I mean, even that is so complicated because, I mean, the word homosexual was not a thing in Bible times. Like, that's something that started getting kind of read into our translations. I don't remember the dates exactly, but I want to say the last 100 years, if not less. Yeah, so we've got this very ancient Christian tradition and these ancient texts and these kind of modern understandings that get read into them, and all the questions of kind of culture and what even was the Apostle Paul talking about when he says these words, and does it have anything to do with what we talk about when we talk about gay relationships today? And so there's a lot of interpretive questions.
Oh.
There's a lot of inconsistency in how people read scripture. Like, they'll take the passages that say slaves obey their masters and be like, well, clearly we know slavery is wrong now. But then they'll take the passages that say homosexuality is a sin and be like, yeah, that, you know. So there's been a lot of kind of movement within the Christian tradition, but also certain streams being unwilling to move. Yeah.
I see. And it seems like there is no standard way to interpret the scriptures. Um,
Lots of different
so
ways. Yeah.
yeah, because
Yeah.
I think, like, you know, in my head, like, I was you had referred to me to a book that talks that like dives into these topics a little deeper, and I apologize for the
Yeah.
title of the book.
Was that God and the Gay Christian
I
or
don't think it's
Changing Our
that one.
Minds?
Changing our minds.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I feel like I really want to dive into that because I want to know,
Mhm.
like, how do you change people's minds, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard, right? Like, I think people think that, like, oh, I have this view that's just based on the Bible, but really there's all these other things that go into it.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a matter of like admitting those things, and including kind of more different perspectives in those things, right? Like, I mean, I think for me it was huge to just hear from more queer folks about how they've been hurt by churches and be like, no, that's clearly not like what Jesus would want, or like
Hmm.
that doesn't line up with the what I understand is like a loving God. And yeah, I think it's powerful to hear stories sometimes more than just kind of this Greek word is that, although that's important too.
Hmm. Yeah. So like with the in the Buddhist traditions, like if you go back to the more traditional kind of Buddhism, there is like the Pali Canon, which is like the Bible of Buddhism.
Mm,
And very much like the Bible, it's been translated in multiple ways, and
mhm.
like, you know, depending on how you translate it, the way you interpret it is completely different. And the way that like my teachers
Right.
teach from it, I can read the same words and come up with like completely like, you know,
Right.
nonsensical
Yeah.
interpretations as well. So
Mhm.
now I like, you know, through Buddhism, I really like appreciated like we don't, if you learn the Pali, which is the original language it was written down, and then the appreciation of like what the Buddha taught changes,
Mhm.
because now you're getting as close as possible to
Right.
when he was you know, actively teaching. And even
Mhm.
then it was
Mhm.
written down like, you know, much later after he died,
Sure.
and it was passed down orally first. So
Mhm.
then,
Mhm.
you know, there's a lot of like um interpretations, human interpretations that went on
Right. Right.
for many generations as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I feel like that's something that I didn't know about the Bible. For some reason, I thought that, you know, like this is it, like this is the word of God.
Yeah. Right.
And it was
Yeah.
back when there were not as many translations public, like that are so easily accessible too. I remember I had like NIV or something in King James.
Mhm.
That's it. Like there is
Mhm.
no other
Mhm.
translation of the Bible available.
Right. Yeah.
So, so what is your favorite translation right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's good to just read different ones. So like when I went to Fuller Seminary, they had kind of like a recommendation for like our academic papers of using NIV, NRSV, or CEB, which is a Common English Bible.
Hmm.
So that kind of got me in the habit of trying to go back and forth kind of among those three. I also, it's in another room, but more recently, there's a New Testament translation that came out. I think it's called First Nations translation of the New Testament. So this group of Indigenous scholars got together and kind of, yeah, translate the New Testament in a way that made sense to them. And so I think that's been good for me to read a little bit of, just because it's fresh to me, right? Like it's
Mhm.
sometimes you hear those verses the same way and they kind of lose meaning. So
Oh,
yeah,
okay, I'm
I've been
definitely
enjoying
buying a
them.
copy of that.
Yeah, I think it's First Nations version translation of the New
And it's in
Testament.
English,
Yes,
like,
yes,
but
it's
through their
English.
lens. Oh,
Hmm.
that's so beautiful. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I was all ready to be like, oh, it was like mostly male scholars. I'm not gonna like this, but then I started reading. I was like, oh yeah, this is really good. I'll allow it.
Oh, that's so funny. So is there going to be a Liz Jenkins version of the Bible anytime soon?
No, I don't think I would like to add to that. I think there's some good ones out there. But I do think it's helpful, like you said, to read it in the original language. And I think that does change, like you said, how you read it. And I mean, I think for me, it's just kind of opened up different possibilities and helped me realize, like, oh, there's a lot of ambiguity to that statement. Like it could mean this or it could mean this. And
Mhm.
I think it's just helpful to be aware of that, that there's not necessarily one right way to translate something.
Mm. Oh, so I remember I had a version of the Bible that had the apocryphal
Mm.
chapters, and I'm still like, so what are those? I'm still not sure what they are, and like, what are your views on them?
Oh, me neither. No, that's not something I know much about at all. Sorry.
Oh. Ah.
Yeah, somehow we didn't really get into reading those in seminary. Yeah, I think that's another question for another time.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
It's the reason why I was asking was because like in Buddhism, like there is the Pali Canon,
Mhm,
which is more about like stories about either what the Buddha directly said, kind of like this like Jesus, the Bible, what Jesus said, what
mhm,
highlighted
mhm,
in red,
mhm.
like that, but with the Buddha,
Yeah.
and then but there's like so much literature from like for the thousands of years after that that come from like that called commentaries.
Mhm,
They
mhm,
coming from like practitioners that come
mhm.
later. And like a lot of what we practice now comes from the commentaries, like
Okay. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well.
Mhm,
So
yeah.
and what I'm learning from reading this book called Catholicism and Zen is
Hmm.
that like there are some sects of Catholicism that's very much similar to Buddhism in how they emphasize meditation and
Hmm.
emptiness, but it comes from like certain monks, like Catholic monks
Mhm,
that practice later on. And
mhm.
it's like, so like for you, like are there certain commentary equivalents that you really enjoy, or like I guess technically you are writing one. Like
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think I know what you mean, at least a bit about kind of, at least within the Christian tradition, some of those monks and nuns who practice kind of more of a mystical faith. And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I feel like there's a lot to learn from them for sure. Um, as far as commentaries go, I mean, there's definitely like kind of modern day Christian writers I feel like I've been learning from, if that counts as a
Yeah, that
commentary.
counts.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think after I graduated from seminary, I was very aware that like most of the reading we were assigned in our courses was written by white dudes. So I was kind of trying to figure out like what have women written, what have people of color written. So yeah, I mean, I feel like um, I don't. There's a lot of kind of modern day writers that I've kind of sought out after seminary. I feel have been helpful. So like Rachel Held Evans, Sarah Bessey. There's a lot of people writing, and some kind of not necessarily specifically Christian writers, but I feel like are very much in line with what I believe or want to believe, and it helped me think about things like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks. Yeah, I feel like those are kind of some of the people who are shaping my thinking. Yeah. How about you?
So, what is the content of their writing? Like, are they saying how they interpret the Bible, like,
Hmm.
their story?
Yeah, I would say a mix. Yeah, I mean, Rachel Held Evans got into a lot of kind of personal stories combined with like what even is church or what do we want it to be? It's like what does community look like and ritual and faith practice. And she did also write a book that was more about the Bible in particular. It's called Inspired. Sarah Bessey, I would say, yeah, kind of similar, like mix of kind of memoir, spiritual reflection, Bible reflection. Yeah. Um, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, kind of more like social commentary, but kind of with an eye toward like how do we love, how do we pursue justice, that kind of thing. Yeah.
That's a wonderful list. And I feel
Yeah.
like, yeah, like we need people like you who can tell us what to read because it's actually not easy to Google. Like,
Right, right.
yeah.
Do you have kind of writers who are speaking to you or historical commentators?
Yeah, gosh, I feel like there are certain like books I really like. So Ajahn Brahm, who is a monk who lives in Australia,
Hmm.
he like, hmm, he describes this like lack of ego in a language that is much more accessible, I think,
Mhm, mhm,
and much more simpler. And also he like
mm.
his persona that he's adopting right now is one who like jokes around, makes really really bad dad jokes all the time.
Okay.
So he's made like the teachings a lot more accessible to the average
Mhm.
person.
That's cool.
And he does it deliberately. Like he has a whole like theory about like how the Buddha had said in the original scriptures that you have to adapt the teachings to the way people
Mm,
act and behave according to the times,
mhm,
and like a lot of these like ancient Buddhist teachings are like so archaic that it's really hard for us to adopt into our lives. We just don't even
mm,
understand them. And also, I think the other like nuance is like a lot of these Buddhist teachings, there's like a body of stuff for like monastics and how they can practice and how
mhm,
like the average person can practice.
mhm,
And I think a lot of these like confusions can arise when we're trying to like mix and match a little too much and not realize that like we can
mhm,
unintentionally cause our own suffering when we try to practice like a monk or a nun when we don't live their life.
mhm, mhm,
So
mhm,
so I think for me, that's why that led me to my teacher, Gil Fronsdale, in the Insight Meditation Center in this tradition, which is much more like what he calls like natural Buddhism,
mm,
like which is like not relying nor denying supernatural aspects of
mm,
Buddhism, like rebirth. Um,
mhm,
though he personally doesn't believe in rebirth. But also like changing the language to be more about our modern day Western life suffering,
mhm, mhm.
like low
Yeah, yeah.
self-esteem and like, you know,
Right,
shitty things happening. Well, what do you do with that?
right, right. Yeah, yeah, that's good. I mean, I feel like there's definitely analogies there in terms of like Jesus says these things that we're like, what? How do you put that in 21st century US? And
Mhm.
there's a lot of kind of like agrarian and like farming metaphors that like for those of us who live in cities, it's like I don't know. Yeah, so I think that's helpful to have teachers or pastors or writers who can kind of help us understand like what might this mean for us.